Hi friends, it's Amy Chappell from Amorini Designs, and today we're here to talk more about binding. In our previous two videos, we've covered both how to figure out how much binding you need and how to prepare your fabric to be binding. And then the last video we talked about how to attach your binding to the front of your quilt sandwich. Today we're going to talk about how to join these loose ends together and some tips that I have found, especially when you're working on a small area like these little mug rugs where you have a little less real estate to help with facilitating joining these together. The first way that I like to do is to take my two loose ends and I'm going to just create a fold in one end, and then I'm going to make a fold in the second side that butts right up next to that first side. So you can see my two little folded edges right there. And then I either just unfold those two and I will line up those creases. I'm gonna put my two sides right side together, line up my creases, and sew right along that crease line. Or I will trim my binding 1/4 inch away from that crease line, so towards my loose end on both sides, and then I will line up those two raw edges right sides together. So again, you're gonna unfold them, line them up right sides together, and then sew it down on, it will be right on that folded line, which will be 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure you press that seam open and then it will lay nice and flat. The second way that I like to do it is I will take and this is similar to the first way, it's just another way to measure out the difference in the two so you have just enough fabric to create a 1/4 inch seam between the two ends. So what I will do in this case is I will trim one end so it's nice and square. And I'm just gonna slide this at an angle a little bit so it's easier for you to see. And I will use a ruler. I will line up that mark with one of the marks on my ruler. And then I'm going to lay the other binding piece on top of it. And I'm gonna measure 1/2 inch away from where they overlap so that the overlap between the two is 1/2 inch. And then I will mark and trim that binding right at that 1/2 inch mark. So I will just cut this right here. And then I will again go to my sewing machine. Now you'll see here that I have not left myself a lot of room. I may end up needing to unpick a few stitches, or I find that if I just fold my quilt sandwich in half, then I can give myself enough wiggle room here to line up those two edges and do my 1/4 inch seam allowance, again, pressing that seam allowance open. The final method works really well, especially if you haven't left yourself a lot of room, but you want to make sure that you don't want to have to unpick things and you want to give yourself just a nice, good edge, is to press under one end of your binding 1/4 inch, and then you're going to fold it in half, and then you're going to take your second piece of binding and you're going to trim it so that they only overlap about 1 inch, 1.5 inches. Then you're going to put the binding with the raw edge inside the binding with the folded edge, and you'll press those together, make sure that they're nice and flat. And then you're gonna go ahead and sew that down without sewing the two ends together. Because our binding is so small, it's not going to create any problems for you, and it will give you a nice edge without having to sew them together. And that works especially well like on a project like this with a very short side, especially if you haven't left yourself a lot of room. This is a really quick method for just tucking one end inside the other after you have folded over a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it does it without giving you a ton of bulk in your seam allowance. So that's 3 quick and easy methods for joining your ends of your binding together.